the Reverend Joe Von Roo, and I serve First Parish in Concord as the Minister in Residence. I'm here to welcome you today and give you a few logistics. There are bathrooms. If you go out to the lobby and down the stairs, they'll be on your right-hand side. They're a little bit tricky to find, so just keep walking. Exits are in the back and on the side, should we need to leave the building. Please turn off all noise-making devices that may be interruptive to the speakers. And we're so excited that you're here. As Unitarian Universalists, we walk the path of our 7 principles, and the first of our 7 principles calls us to affirm, covenant and affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And so as a formerly homeless person myself, it is nice that we're having this kind of thing happening in our parish so that we can be aware of what is out there and so that we can do the work that we need to do to help those people to find warmth and to find shelter. From the vantage point of people with homes, it's important that we feel this urgency because we don't understand it. So the more understanding that we can glean from listening to talks like this, the better off we'll be. I hope that you'll enjoy this video.
I'm 35 years old. I got 2 children who have autism. I also have 2 emotional support dogs. This is where I stayed in this car with both my children and the dogs. Both my children sat here behind where I'm sitting at this right now. March 5th, 2016. It was 23 degrees outside. We were cold. I didn't get my services. I had to go in the DT office 3 to 4 times. They have the help, they refused me. So I had to be in an unfit place in order for me to get the help I needed. So I stayed in the car. In this car, in one night, cold in March. My children, both 8 and 11, didn't have no food, no water, and were crying.
Do you think that the law needs to change around staying in places unfit for human habitation to qualify for EA services?
No, they don't need to be in an unfit place to get help. They should get help immediately, like be in a shelter, immediately, not just living in a car, staying in the hospital, or in the streets, sleeping in the bench. If you see somebody staying in the streets or whatever, give them the help.
And Lynette, do you work? What kind of job do you work?
I became a home health aide. I thank the Lord that this company took me in and making me who I am today. I work my hardest. I don't give up, nor do I sit down. I do what I do to survive. I would like every single person working in that stay house to spend one night with no food, no water. I'm talking about a place that looks unfit, and staying there for that whole night, that way you can see how hard it was just to stay one night. I want you all to experience what I experienced. I hope this message you all can understand that. And I appreciate you giving me a chance to listen to me and at least watch me. And I hope you all hear me and listen to me.
I'd like to welcome you to the 13th Forum on Family Homelessness, organized by the Advocacy Network to End Family Homelessness. My name is Jane Blumberg, and I'm on the steering committee of the Advocacy Network and also a member of First Parish. The Advocacy Network was formed 14 years ago in response to the worsening low-income housing and homelessness crisis in Massachusetts. And we're committed to eliminating the root causes and the adverse consequences of family homelessness through public education and through advocacy. We're a grassroots group. We now have over 900 advocates from 20 communities who receive our alerts during the state's budget season. Citizens who let their legislators know that they support key programs that keep families in their houses and out of cars. Lynette Martin and the 3,500 other homeless families in our state are why each of us are here right now. You've all been given a program in your packet, so I won't say too much about that, other than to say that following our speakers and some brief Q&As, we will be moving down to the parish hall for cake, a chance to visit with service organizations who do really important work, and to follow up with the speakers that you'll be hearing from today. Please do stay for the parish hall portion. It's an important part of this, and we're locking the doors just in case. If you came today as a seasoned advocate, we hope you leave re-energized and better informed. If you have never advocated with your legislators before, we need you to join us. Lynette Martin needs you to join us. And the 3,500 other families need you to just pick up the phone, write a letter, support these programs. And now I'd like to introduce Frank Austin, the convener of the Advocacy Network.
Thank you, Jane, and good afternoon to all of you. As billed, I am Frank Austin. I'm with the Advocacy Network to End Family Homelessness. Jane did a good job of explaining who we are and where we have been. First, I'd like to thank both Jane and Reverend Joe Van Roo for having us here in this wonderful place of worship. As Jane mentioned, we will enjoy the speakers here, and then we will go down to the parish hall for the final discussions. One additional thought I'd like to add to who we are, and that is, and I always like to say this, we're cost-free. We're a completely volunteer organization, and so our forums, our workshops, all that we do is free to those who are interested and to our members. Today, we're going to hear first about more work on the very important issue of health effects on children in homeless families and on the caregivers to those families as well. We'll then hear about the experience of living in shelters for families, get a sense as to exactly what their experience is like, and then finally, and most importantly, we're going to talk about the very issue that Lynette Martin had to suffer through, and what specifically we can do to change that. So we're going to hear those three things, and unfortunately I've taken too much time. We're going to have to move this right along. So first is an old friend, Dr. Megan Sandell. Dr. Sandell is the Associate Director of the Grow Clinic at Boston Medical Center, and she's a nationally recognized expert on homelessness and children. And frankly, if you want a place to put your heart to start on this little journey of advocacy, it's with the children, because they are the innocent participants in this whole mess. So let's hear from Dr. Sandell on what she has heard, and as I say, she has given us a very compelling forum speech in the past, and I think that's what I need to say. Dr. Megan Sandell, please help me welcome.
All right, people can hear me in the back, yes? All right, I'm gonna stand here. Can people see me? That's the other good. All right, because then I can see my slides, which will help with hopefully doing the talk. I think, thank you so much for having me. Some people may not realize I grew up in Concord, so I'm a proud graduate of CCHS, and really have had a wonderful childhood here. And went to college and medical school and then came back to Boston in 1996, and I've been working at Boston Medical Center ever since. And in many ways, I am going to talk about the effects of homelessness on children and caregivers, but I'm also hoping to really inspire you about finding solutions to homelessness and housing instability, and doing that together, because ultimately that's the root for health equity. The roadmap for my talk will be, I'll talk kind of different dimensions of how homes impact health. I'm going to talk about things like quality and stability and affordability and location. Because as I've learned over kind of my 20 years as a pediatrician, it's not just one way that homes can impact health. And I'll talk a little bit about how a home can act like a vaccine. It can keep you healthy now and in the future, particularly an affordable home. I'll talk about just in medicine, we now talk about population health, and why a lot of the root causes of why healthcare is so expensive is related to homelessness and housing instability. And then I'll talk about some possible solutions, and then end with this idea of equity and why equity is so important. When we think about home inequality, there are a lot of ways in which those are tied together, and many families who are trying to avoid homelessness will actually end up in homes of really poor quality, things that can cause accidents or other things that can trigger asthma, conditions like mold and chronic dampness, pest infestations like mice or cockroaches, ways in which there sometimes can be lead exposure in the home, and that's going to be something that's not just going to affect you now, it may affect you in the future. And for many of our families, they may be in a really drafty house that actually means that they're having to pay a lot of money for heat, and therefore they may not have enough money for food. And those toxic trade-offs, I think, underlie a lot of how housing quality can impact health. What we sometimes don't always tie together is this idea of whether or not home quality affects your mental health. And one thing that we know actually is that the poor housing quality will actually be related to child behavioral health. One of the strongest predictors of kids sometimes acting out can be the fact that they're living in a substandard home, actually. And that travels through the parents. The stress that the parents feel by living in a home where there may be mold, or it's damp, or there are cockroaches or mice. Those are really things that not only affect the kid, but affect their parent. So as we think about kind of kid stress, I want us to think about caregiver stress and how that can be incredibly important also. When I talk about housing stability, I often will talk first about this idea of homelessness. And homelessness is the part of the iceberg you can see, right? That's the 35,000 or 3,500 families in Massachusetts that are homeless. What we don't realize is that actually there's a hidden homeless group, a group that often will have things like overcrowding or doubled up. Sorry, I'm giving winking and nodding to my person here who's being really helpful. Do one more click. And then those are families that are having to move multiple times because they're having difficulty with staying in one place. They're staying with a relative 1 month and then they're staying with another relative the next month. They may be overcrowded. They may be sleeping in a living room because that's the place that's taking them in. Or they may be doubled up. And ultimately the root of this is unaffordable housing. What we've looked at is, as we think about unaffordable housing, on the next slide is this idea of looking at just a simple concept of behind on rent. We actually just published this in Pediatrics last month. And what we looked at was 3 forms of housing stability. We looked at homelessness, we looked at moving at least twice in a year, and then we looked at this idea of being behind on rent. And what you'll see is that if you report that just in the last month, at some point, you weren't able to pay your rent on time, you'll see these huge rates of food insecurity, 4 times higher rates of food insecurity, 3.5 times higher rates of child food insecurity. You're reporting cutting back on the size of your kids' meals because of your inability to pay. You're already maybe not paying the heat bill. You've gotten a threatened notice from a utility company to shut off your heat. And you're already foregoing a lot of health care. You're not purchasing medication, or you're not seeking the doctor, or things like that. What was striking to us is that I think we knew that this was going to be causing illness, but I don't think we understood the extent of which this was going to be making people sick. The last one is this idea of eviction prevention, right? So if you go to the next slide, how many people have heard of the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Oh, great. So if people want to understand the situation, not just homelessness, but the people who are on the verge of homelessness, about to be evicted, I really encourage you to read that book. It actually won a Pulitzer Prize. It was on Barack Obama's top 100 list last year, but it follows 8 families in Milwaukee that have gone through the eviction process. And Matt is a good friend of mine. We actually added into some of our research looking at eviction. So if you look on the next slide, we asked families if in the past 5 years they had a history of eviction. And the families that said yes had much higher rate of fair or poor health, developmental risk, maternal depression, and having high rates of food insecurity. So the ability to prevent an eviction through something like RAFT, which you guys are going to hear about later, is an amazing health intervention to prevent long-lasting effects. Next slide. The last piece is this idea of location. And the reason I bring it up is that though we're going to focus on homelessness today, and we're going to talk about bills that are going to prevent people from becoming homeless or prevent some of the ill effects of homelessness, I also think it's important for us to talk about things like the Great Neighborhoods Bill, which is about building affordable housing in neighborhoods of opportunity. And so what this is a map that is actually looking at New York City, if you recognize it. And what you're supposed to notice here is the overlap between the black dots and the dark red neighborhoods. And what that shows you is the black dots are marking neighborhoods that in 1995 had concentrated poverty. Over a third of the people living there were below the federal poverty line. And the dark red neighborhoods are places 20 years later that continue to have concentrated poverty. And so when you think about it, those are places that people are living where a generation of people have not been exposed to the types of opportunities that are needed. On the next slide, I'll show you actually a map of the city of Boston. And so for those people that recognize, we can see the Back Bay is up there, right? And this is like now on the seaport. And then this is Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, right? So those are where most of my patients live at Boston Medical Center. And what this maps is actually an index developed by the Kirwan Institute at Ohio State to map opportunity. So the dark red areas are the highest opportunity areas. You can see where I live in Brookline, right, in the up top corner. And then you see the yellow areas are actually where there's low opportunity. So that's where most of my patients live. And when we see it, the circles represent kids at age 3 that have an elevated blood pressure. A blood pressure that's above the 95th percentile. So the larger the circle is the higher the prevalence. And so if you think about this, this is how opportunity maps to your biology. You are starting to feel the stress of that neighborhood at even the age of 3. And so as we think about it, it's important to have a stable, decent, affordable home, but we have to have a stable, decent, affordable home in a good neighborhood if we're going to have the ultimate effects. Next slide. So as we think about kind of how could a home act like a vaccine, I'm going to give you the 1-minute tour of why we vaccinate. So we vaccinate for personal protection, right, to help you be immune. But we also vaccinate for this concept of herd immunity, to protect other people around us. And so the cartoon that you can see up here is the blue people are people that are not immunized but healthy. The people who are yellow are people who are healthy and immunized, and the red people are people who aren't immunized and get sick. And so to walk you through the 3 cartoons, the top one is where you have a community, nobody's immunized, a couple people come in that are sick, everybody gets sick, right? The middle one is a place where most people aren't immunized, a handful of people are. A couple people come in and are sick, most people get sick. The only people who don't get sick are the ones that are immunized. The bottom one is the key cartoon, because in that one, most people are immunized, and a handful of people aren't. There, when a couple people come in that are sick, the people who aren't immunized don't get sick. 2 out of the 3 that aren't immunized don't get sick, because everyone around them is able to buoy them, to protect them, to provide some resilience. And so as we think about kind of why vaccines are important, we know from history that they have both an economic and community benefit. And that we know that there are click a couple times, there are other ways in which there are communities where that herd immunity breaks down in, say, measles outbreaks and other things. Go to the next slide. Yeah, one more click. And then, so we actually published a paper in 2005, which tried to look at this idea of how did an affordable home protect you, give you some immunity. And so what we found was we looked at food insecure families. The families that had kids that were food insecure were twofold less likely to have stunted growth if they were getting an affordable housing subsidy than the other families that were eligible for that subsidy not receiving it. And so as we think about that, right, the affordable housing subsidy protected you from having the biologic consequences of your food insecurity. It gave you some resilience against that threat. It acted like a vaccine. And so what we know from vaccines is that we know that they're pretty cost effective, but it's interesting, they're cost effective in two ways. And so when we look at healthcare costs alone for something like chickenpox vaccine, it actually doesn't save you money on healthcare costs. It costs about $2 for every case that's averted. But when you take into account societal benefits, for every dollar you spend on a chickenpox vaccine, you get $5 back societally. And so my kids got vaccinated against chickenpox, not just to protect them from getting chickenpox, but to make sure I stayed at work and I paid taxes, right? It was a societal benefit that tipped it over. And so as we think about investing in housing as a way to prevent homelessness, we have to take into account not just the individual benefit, but the societal benefit again. All right, so in my world right now, we have this term called population health. And the reason I bring it up is that I love it and hate it. I love it in the fact that it's my hospital system's way of now acknowledging the social determinants and getting out of the individual patient interaction and thinking on a broader scale. The problem is it subsumes a term called public health that's been around for like 2 centuries and tries to redefine it. But this is our way of starting to think about how we look at people as we talk about the population health pyramid. When we think about healthcare costs, one of the not so dirty secrets is that not everyone uses the same amount of healthcare. And so when we look at this, the top 5% of people on a population health pyramid use 50% of the dollars, okay? And when you unpack that 5% using 50% of the dollars, for instance, say at my hospital at Boston Medical Center, we think 40% of them are homeless or housing unstable. So you can imagine you're getting the best medical care possible, but if you don't have a place to go at night and you don't have a place to store your medicine or to send the home health aid or other things that you need, you can imagine you're not going to be as effective. What's interesting for us is that we looked at the high risk of homelessness and then tried to look at homelessness versus, say, multiple moves or housing instability or other things. And so we tried to unpack in our research whether or not there were differences between homelessness and housing instability and healthcare costs. Next slide. So my research is pitted in a network called Children's Health Watch, which is headquartered at Boston Medical Center. It's a nonpartisan network of pediatricians and public health researchers. Our goal is to improve the health and development of particularly young children by focusing on policies around common hardships, things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, energy insecurity, healthcare cost trade-offs. And so when we look at our data, we collected actually in emergency departments and primary care clinics. So at Boston Medical Center, we're in the pediatric emergency department. We're in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Little Rock, and Minneapolis. And we interview families with young children. The reason we focus on young kids is that they're largely an invisible population. They're not in school yet typically, and yet that's when you're growing the brain you need for the rest of your life. It's an incredibly important biologic window where these hardships can kind of impact kids. And so we started to look at things like how does homelessness impact health? And so we published a brief with the National Housing Center around trying to estimate the excessive hospitalizations in young kids related to homelessness. And we estimate it's over $200 million annually is being spent on hospitalizations that we think are only attributable to being homeless. And half of the costs are in young children. We also looked at this idea of timing and duration of homelessness. And what's here is really kind of, in some ways, really eye-opening. We knew that being homeless during the prenatal period was really important. And so we looked at things like, were there birth effects, low birth weight or prematurity or other things. What we didn't expect was that this would carry over into childhood. And so what we're seeing here is effects in the red is prenatal homelessness only. You're only homeless in the prenatal period. You still are at adverse risk of fair or poor health. developmental risk or having a hospitalization in your lifetime. If you're homeless in the postnatal period, you also are at similar risk. But if you're homeless in both periods, in the prenatal period through to when you deliver and go home to a homeless shelter, you have double the risk of these types of outcomes. Next slide. And then when we think about duration, click it one more time, what we see is young children, infants, kids under 12 months, if they're homeless for longer than 6 months, you see this doubling of the effects over very poor health, developmental risk, and high risk for hospitalization. So the ability to get people rapidly rehoused, speaking to some of the programs, Home Base and others, those are really important to lessening the health effects of homelessness. Next slide. I'm going to go through this really quickly as the health risks of unstable housing. The take home of this slide is that when we looked at kids that were homeless, we knew those kids would be sick. But what we didn't expect was that the kids that were moving multiple moves and were behind on rent look the same as homeless kids. So when we think about that, the number of people we need to serve is not just the 3,500 number of people that are homeless, it's all the people that are in the pipeline to homelessness. That's why we need to build more. That's why we need to offer more vouchers, is that we want to solve homelessness, but the way to do that is also to solve housing instability. Keep going. Next slide, sorry. Yeah, and then just skip through this. We have a housing stability vital sign as a way to try to identify those people that are at risk. So was there a time you weren't able to pay your rent or mortgage? How many places have you lived in the past year, and any time did you stay in a shelter? Next slide. So as we think about examples for this, one of the cool things is that we're starting to do partnerships. And so at Boston Medical Center, we started a Housing Prescriptions as Healthcare program. This was through the Boston Foundation, where we created a partnership between Boston Housing Authority, Project Hope, which is an amazing social service organization, Nuestra Comunidad, and our local medical legal partnership. And what we're doing is identifying families that aren't homeless yet, and are seeing families that have somebody that is utilizing a lot of healthcare and intervening with a set of housing prescriptions to prevent homelessness and prevent health effects. And that to us is the ultimate, is are there ways in which we as healthcare can show up with new solutions to try and make this better? Next slide. So the last slide that I have is around homes as health equity. And the reason I bring this up is that I think we talk a lot about equality. And equality is really important, but oftentimes it is not going to get us actually to an equal opportunity for everyone. So the reason that I focus on this is that it's important to understand the difference between equality and equity based on where people start from. And so when we look at the slide that's equality, you have people that are 3 different heights. One's tall, one's medium height, one's short. If you treat them all the same, you give them one box to stand on. Only the tall person gets to that apple of opportunity in the tree. But when you get to the equity side, when you treat people equitably, you give them what they need to be successful. You give the tall person 1 box. You give the medium height person 2 boxes. You give the short person 3 boxes. They will all then get to that equal opportunity in the tree. And so what's the tension of equity is that to get everyone to the fair shot playing field, you have to treat them unequally. You have to give some people more. And that's inherent in us. Many of us have been blessed with our privilege. There are many people that are shorter and need more help. And that is equity. That is what we need to do to get to the even playing field. We should acknowledge that there are a lot of reasons why people are different height, from structural racism and others, and that this is the way that we're going to ultimately get to everyone having the fair shot. And so with that, I think I hopefully stayed within my 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very good. And we're going to hold on the Q&A until we get to the very end, if you don't mind, for time purposes. I would like to comment, though, on numbers, because we've heard the number of 3,500 families, and I'd like to point out that that is families in shelter now. It does not talk about what the doctor was speaking about, those who are at risk of homelessness, those who are unstable in their housing. And those figures have been estimated in Massachusetts to approach something like 20,000 families who are right in that brink of stress. And so to add to the point of what is the effect on Lynette Martin in her car. If she was a stressed family, she and her kids were in trouble, regardless of whether she was part of the 3,500 or not. So, now we need to hear the next step. We had the opportunity in October to go to community teamwork in Lowell and hear a very interesting presentation in the Conversation series. And it was entitled, "What Does Housing Have to Do with Health?" And we learned a lot from that, and in fact brought that back to our need to bring health into the picture as to what's the importance of our advocacy for homeless families. One of the prime movers in that discussion was a gentleman by the name of Carl Howell. And Carl is the Division Director of Housing and Services for the Homeless. He has over 15 years of human service experience, and since 2010, he has developed and managed family shelter, home-based, domestic violence-related programs. So he is the gentleman who will talk to us about the experience of family shelter. Please welcome Carl Howell.
Quite the experience here, all these things in my hands. Good afternoon. As you said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the EA family shelter experience. This is specifically families, not talking about individuals in homeless shelters. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
You gotta keep the mic up to your mouth. Rockstar style.
Here we go.
Do you want a music stand?
Music stand?
Yeah,
That'd be great. That's all right. Very good eyes. That's good. Thank you. So the first thing I'm going to really talk to you about is really kind of so the first thing I want to talk to you about is just EA Family Shelter, and kind of give you kind of a broad kind of a definition. I'm sorry. I'll be fine. Yeah, I think I just have to learn to hold like this. So the first thing about EA Family Shelter, it's a right, which means that families have a right to apply for it. So every family that wants to enter an EA shelter has to go down to a state office and basically plead their case that they need shelter. And there's a vast criteria for them to get into shelter. And income's one, their reason for homelessness is another, and they have to be a state resident. The challenge with that is, for some of the reasons that even Dr. Sandel pointed out, that there's an invisible population of homelessness, the overcrowded, the doubled up, those living in places not meant for habitation. For you to prove that you are eligible for shelter, you need some type of document to show that. They just can't take your word for it. And so a really challenging and the kind of traumatic experience that our families go through is having to plead and show that they are actually homeless. If you're evicted, if you are a victim of natural disaster or a fire victim, it's very easy to show a state form that says, this is why I'm homeless and I need assistance ASAP. If you are living in a park or an abandoned building or in your car, or you're couch surfing, you're bouncing from place to place to place, or you live with a family and friend, you're not on the lease, but they're asking you to leave, there's no document for that. So these families are subjected to waiting for an investigation process to even enter shelter. But in the meantime, what are they doing? So that really kind of points out to what Dr. Sandel was talking about. So there are thousands of families that go through this process that makes it really challenging. But I'm going to talk about the ones that are lucky enough to actually get into EA shelter because they have a legal document that explains their homelessness. The other piece to it, once they are deemed eligible, they can be placed anywhere in the state. So if you are a family from, say, Dorchester, you can be placed in Pittsfield or Springfield. There is a expectation that you're placed within a 20-mile radius of where you are applying, but there's there's such a limit to the amount of shelter that they can be sent to anywhere. And we'll get into this, but a lot of the families that we work with have a lot of physical and illnesses, mental illness, substance abuse challenges that they're working through. And when they leave, they get really removed from all those support services, as well as their family and friends that kind of they rely on. So this is kind of a 30,000 foot view, the kind of big picture when it comes to shelter. Right now in the Lowell area, there's about 160 homeless families. I oversee about 125 of them, but there's another agency, House of Hope, that also supports families in the Lowell area. There are 3 different really models of EA shelter. There's congregate, which is basically one home, every family gets a room, and they share all common spaces. There's also a scattered site model, which is we lease apartments throughout the city and surrounding cities. We place the families into those units until they can move on. And then the last one is a co-share, where 2 families basically share a unit together. And again, those families most likely have to move their whole family into a shelter bedroom that's about maybe 400 square feet or less, depending on the size of their family. And then they share common spaces. In our shelter program, the real challenge that we have is supporting and moving families out of shelter is the income. In just the greater Lowell area, it costs about $1,300 to $1,400 for a 2-bedroom unit. But our median family, the median number of families have 0 income. And our average is about $400. So how do families afford housing? How do they not only pay for housing, but as Dr. Sandel pointed out, how do they pay for all the other things? Clothing their kids, feeding their children, paying utilities, just the general everyday household expenses that we all have, but they can't do that. The other kind of piece is, just imagine you are, let's take a case like, imagine you're a fire victim, and you end up in EA shelter. So you've already gone through this traumatic experience where you've lost everything that you have. Probably all your legal documents. You move into shelter, and now you have a curfew. You can't cook at certain times of the day. You have people that are, for safety reasons, but these rules can be very traumatic and can cause a multiple of issues beyond just the experience that you have with housing. People get depressed. They look for other forms of comfort, and it can be really challenging not only on the family, but it's really damaging to the children that are living in shelter. One of the things I do want to point out is going back to the rent and the income. Even if a family had a full-time job and at minimum wage, they still would not be able to afford a unit in Metro West, Massachusetts. They would need a job that pays $24 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom unit in the greater Lowell area. And the closer you get to Boston, obviously it gets more expensive. It gets more expensive. And for a lot of our families, if they get a minimum wage job, that means they have to work 2 jobs, which means they're working 80 hours a week. Then who's taking care of the children when they're working 2 jobs just to pay their rent? Here's just some data that I pulled over the last 3 years. These are families that we've served at different levels of income and different types of income. The first one is the earned income, TFDC, which people know as the welfare. SSI, child support, social and SSDI, and then unemployment. You can see that even on the earned income, again, a family couldn't afford to even pay their rent, and get by with paying everything else. That's a challenge that these families have to get over. I also want to point out that if you add up all the types of benefits that they are eligible for here, they still would not be able to afford housing. So even if they had an earned income and child support and the other things, they still would not be able to afford housing. And that is a very challenging place for a family to be when they're in shelter, which is right now the best option we have to give these families. But at the same time, it's a very traumatic experience, and leads to what Dr. Sandell about families moving around and being placed in the shelter. You could be moved multiple times within shelter based on occupancy and needs like that, and it really challenging because they're in a place that does not meet their needs and on all their needs, but then they don't have the capability to move out sustainably. So I'm a tall gentleman, so this is my own perspective, 6'6" perspective. First thing I just want to point out again is talking about families moving out of region. This has become a bigger issue over the last 4 or 5 years, families getting placed. It's been pointed out that there's 3,500 shelter units across the state. However, we know that if a family, say a family is from Concord, they're going to get placed in Lowell. That's the closest, if there's an availability in Lowell. So again, they're not even in their community, in their support systems, and how does a family that experiences homelessness from this area, how do they get to and from to get their support and their doctors and so on? It becomes really, really challenging. One of the other kind of things that we've seen is a huge increase in mental health and substance abuse. When I first entered the family homelessness world about 8-10 years ago, I had previously worked with homeless individuals in Baltimore, and working with that population in Baltimore, you saw a lot of mental health, you saw a lot of substance abuse, incarceration history, and I guess ignorantly, I thought it would be a similar type of experience when I came here, and I was wrong. It was more families, down on their luck, the loss of a parent that lost their income, so then they had to end up into shelter because they couldn't afford their rents themselves. But I will say that over the last 8 to 10 years, it has gotten worse. We're starting to see a lot more mental health. We're starting to see a lot more substance abuse in our shelters. The other one that I see is we're also seeing families that have what you call intact families or 2-parent headed households, which is one of the reasons that there's been a huge increase in the size of households, which when you have 2 parents, and it creates a whole new different kind of dynamic in a shelter when you have 2 parents and they're both trying to do what's best for their family, but they're all still struggling with their own grief, trauma, and how they can support their family. We're also seeing a huge number of disabled populations, people that need ADA accommodations. And if you know anything about the housing stock in Massachusetts, it's old, it is not handicap or say accessible. So individuals that need to be on first floor units, there's not many first floor units. Those that need elevators or wheelchair accessible units, they don't exist. It's really, really hard. Even if you have a voucher, it is almost nearly impossible to find a unit that meets your needs in the state of Massachusetts. And that makes it really hard for my staff to support these families who maybe have the means to move out, but really don't have any housing options. I'd also say going to the multi-generational, what I mean by that is we're starting to see the children of we're starting to see adults come into shelter who were the children of families we served in the past. And you're starting to see that cycle of the children aging out, having their own families and then falling back into homelessness. And then just the soft skills, it's you know, the social, emotional, going back to the mental health, and just the chronic or habitual experiences of homelessness can really weigh a family down. You know, it just kind of getting into a little bit of what Dr. Sandell is pointing out regarding the health and how it impacts the youth. There's a book called The Deepest Well, and that really kind of digs into a lot of exactly what Dr. Sandell has been pointing out, is that children who experience poverty, experience low income, have a very high degree of chance of not only in the moment when they're experiencing having health issues, but now they're basically predetermined to experience severe health issues as adults, just because of their experience. And I feel that in shelter, although we're providing that support and that service, there are, again, the hidden population of homeless families that are not able to get into shelter because their $1 over income or some documentation isn't meeting up. That really makes it really traumatic and gives a huge experience of just hope, lack of hope of supporting themselves, and children don't really have their own means to get themselves out of those situations. They're relying on their parents and I would say the government to support them. This is really just talking about the families out of region. 33% are placed out of their place of origin. How much time do we have? Okay, good. Not a lot for the rest of it. And I've covered a lot of this, just the challenges of being removed from all their support systems. And you know, I would say for families in Lowell that have a lot of support services in, say, the Boston area, transportation is the biggest thing. We have families that drive multiple hours just every day just to get their kids to school because they don't want their kids changing school systems. So they wake up at 4:30, drive or get on a bus, bring their kids down to Chelsea or Dorchester, and then take another 2 or 3 hours back home at the end of the day. And that's really, really challenging and burdensome on a family, especially when kids are getting home at 7 o'clock at night. They haven't eaten dinner yet, and then they're starting that process. This is just some data again from the last 3 years of families that we've served that have different types of disabilities. Just looking at this slide, you can see that 605 clients that we worked with had 2 or more disabilities that were reported. Again, different type of disabilities, but it's just really burdensome on a family to be in shelter and potentially have some things that they have to overcome just to do day-to-day activities. Again, mental health, addiction, and disability. We're all aware of the opiate epidemic, the relationship with mental health. We've kind of moved towards having Narcan and training our staff on substance abuse a lot more now. We've had a number of overdoses in our shelter. We have families that are, in a lot of ways self-medicating, trying to just cope with their experience, sadly to say. And, it really kind of is challenging for those families. Domestic violence, that's 16%. This is I think the third highest reason for EA family homelessness. 16%, so of the 35, that means about 500 to 600 families. Their reason for being homeless is because of this domestic violence. Just children and families being exposed to that level of violence where they're in fear for their life every single day. What that does to a person, and the supports that they need to move forward are something that my shelters can't even provide. And we really look to the community to support them on that. Going into family composition has changed a lot. We're starting to see a lot more legal guardians also enter the shelter, where it's grandparents that now have the custody of their children. And at times that poses its own challenges, but just imagine being a grandparent, now you're in shelter because you've taken custody of your children. And potentially have workforce probably isn't hiring due to age, due to maybe the challenges that you've been out of the workforce for a long time. Makes it really difficult for those families to move and get sustainable housing. Here are just a couple of families it's family stories I couldn't have come here, but I just wanted to point out the different types of families you work with and the challenges that it's not just you're homeless, you need a house, and here's some money so that you can move out of shelter. So family A is a family of 5. They have a teenage boy who lost his leg due to a roadside bomb in Africa, and they moved here. Part of that story is the father of the family died in that bomb, and they moved here as refugees. The mother can't work because she has to care for her son. And they're homeless. They're probably in a better place in shelter than they were when they were in Africa, from their own kind of perspective. But they're still dealing with all the loss, all the trauma they've experienced before they were homeless and came to the United States. And we have to really work with them through that. So you have a mom with 5 kids, and it can be really challenging. Then we have family B. It's three families, so it's a mom with 2 kids, and both parents are disabled. They can't work. And this family, because they were receiving some federal government benefits, they started looking at where their money would work the most and go the furthest. In the state of Massachusetts, that wasn't possible. So what they, credit to them, we were pressuring them a little bit, but credit to them, they were really looking and investing a lot of time in where in the country can I live that my disability can support me. And what they ended up doing is they found a place in Montana, and we helped them move to Montana. They found a house. They were able to support their whole family with the wages that they received based on the living costs in Montana, and we helped them move to Montana and move all their belongings out there. But this is the type of these are the type of extreme situations that families have to go through. For family C, family 2, so a mom with a small child. The mother has serious mental illness that impacts her ability to just live a kind of a typical lifestyle, and even though she has money, it's challenging for her to pay her bills on time, which puts her in debt. Always has her in a situation where she is potentially being evicted because of her disorientation and her scatteredness. And the reason I point this family out is going back to the EA shelter family process. The people who do this application and support these families getting into EA shelter, they're not screening for mental illness. They're not screening for things aren't adding up and the disorientation of a person. They're literally answer the question. If this question does not line up with this answer, then there must be a scam. It must be a fraud. They're just trying to get through the system. And I can't tell you how many times that my staff have actually had to go down and explain what's going on with families, because they're not trained to do that. It's not really their job, but this is a reality of anyone that goes down to an office to apply for EA, and they have a mental illness, or they don't have the best presentation or advocacy skills for themselves, they could be denied. I know, I'm sorry. I won't go to D since I'm being pulled off the stage. Just a quick one, 13% of people who enter shelter will return within 3 years, and 23% of them will return within 12 months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. No, I'm not going to sing. The music stand is previous. Thank you, Carl Howe. I must say that I don't know how this sits with all of you, but this is tough stuff to hear. And on so many levels, you want to reach out, and yet these problems just seem enormous. But it's all humanity, and if you're so inclined to believe it, we're here to try to help. And that should be the case for the state of Massachusetts. We have a good friend here. Our good friend Kelly Turley is the Associate Director of Legislative Advocacy for the Coalition, Mass Coalition for Homeless. Kelly and Mass Coalition have been really our earliest and best guides over the year on legislative issues for service to homeless families. And just as an individual, her energy, her experience, and most importantly, her interpersonal skills have been invaluable to our advocacy network. To her credit, the whole time we've been sitting here, she has been taking volumes of notes. She has graciously offered, though, to give our senator, who has just snuck in a little while, one must leave, Senator Jamie Eldridge, some time to speak. The subject has been, Jamie, the focus for our advocacy, H659, to stop the shelter restriction that's requiring 600, 700 families to stay in an unsafe place. And we know you have sponsored that, as have our other legislators. And I was wondering if you would take just a few minutes, understanding you have a schedule, but if you could just take a second for us and just let us know what you think.
Well, thank you, Frank. I wasn't sure when I was going. So this is a terrific turnout, and I think I've come almost every year. Some of my favorite advocates and advocacy organizations, from Dr. Sandell to Kelly to Carl and your organizations and the whole advocacy network. So thanks so much for having me, and I apologize I have to go to some other events today as well. Hopefully, is Representative Atkins going to be coming soon? Or?
No, unfortunately, I think she's got another commitment as well.
Her mom needed her.
Okay.
So she's with her mom.
Okay. I heard a rumor there was going to be a cake provided to her.
Yes.
Yes. There's a lot of cake.
That's right. That's right. Representative Atkins is retiring at the end of this season, so we wanted to mark that.
Yeah, and I would just say to that point, since Corey can't be here, is that I really just want to pay tribute to her, because she's been an incredible advocate for all low-income families and residents, and I think almost every year she's come to this advocacy network. So she's been a tremendous champion for homeless families for her 10 plus years as a state representative. I do just want to recognize in the audience, because election season will be beginning soon, Tammy Gouveia, who's a candidate for state rep for the 4th Middlesex. And I can't help but recognize Dot Wurst. Dot, how are you? Dot is not a candidate for the seat, but I was able to get Dot and Frank a parking spot at the State House for the advocacy day, the coalition. So I know Frank had wanted me to talk about House 659, so this would repeal the regulation by DHCD that requires families that are homeless, that they wouldn't have to prove that they were living in a place that was unsuitable for habitability. So in other words, right now, and I think most people here probably know this, is that if you are homeless, you actually have to prove that you're even living in sort of a really bad apartment, or in some cases if you're sleeping in a car, etc. So that's the rule, and I want to emphasize is it's not a recent ruling. This goes back, unfortunately, to the Patrick Murray administration. So it's been disappointingly bipartisan. And I guess the way I would look at it is, people always say, and I remember whenever I talk to Dot about it, she says that's outrageous. Why would the state government have this policy? And in my opinion, it's a way to save money. It's a way to limit the number of people who are eligible for shelter. And for me, that just speaks to the need for more funding for vouchers, for affordable housing. In my opinion, I know this is an issue that I brought up here before, is housing production and zoning reform. Is that if we're really serious about making sure that there aren't homeless families in Massachusetts, every community needs to step up to provide affordable housing. And that is something I'm hoping the legislature will take up, is a housing production zoning reform bill that would do a variety of things. But one of the proposals is that every community would have to provide a site or an area in town where there would be multifamily housing. So I just think that's important to advocate for, especially in suburbs. And the example I was given, Acton, and I used to serve at the Acton Housing Authority before I was elected, is that the Acton Housing Authority, when it built 12 units of low-income housing, it actually set aside 3 of those units for homeless families. So we had homeless families who were living in Boston and Lynn that were placed in Acton. So if every community would step up to build housing for low-income families, not, quite honestly, most of the 40B housing is not for really poor people. It's really for, teachers, firefighters, sort of strictly middle-class people. But if we build more housing for low-income families, we could really address, the homelessness crisis. The bill that I was proud to co-sponsor with Representative Marjorie Decker, House 659, that would repeal this regulation, has been reported out of the Joint Committee on Housing. So it's been sent to the House Ways and Means Committee. So it's really important, in my opinion, for you to contact your state representatives and ask them to ask the House Ways and Means Chair, Representative Jeffrey Sanchez, to bring this bill to the floor to vote by the House. And I feel on the Senate side, I feel very optimistic that there's strong support for the bill. So it's really just getting it past the House. So reaching out to Corey, reaching out to Jen Benson, Kate Hogan, other area state reps, to ask them for it to be brought up. So that is, I think that was the main task I was going to talk about, and then of course has already been discussed, or maybe Kelly was going to talk about. The budget is coming up, so certainly advocating for everything from AHVP to MRVP to other important funding sources to combat homelessness. So I will be leading the fight on those areas in the Senate as well. And thanks so much for having me, and I apologize that I have to leave soon. Thank you.
Thank you for your Thank you very much. There's a lot to be said about all of the issues that the Senator just went over. In your packet, I'll just commit you to some information that we have our complete list of budget issues that we're supporting in that packet. And as well, we have a list of legislative issues, bills that we are supporting, including great neighborhoods, zoning changes, the housing bond bill, all of which represent longer-term changes that we need to have. But I can't spend a lot of time on this. We're going to move this right along. So, Kelly, thank you very much. And Kelly is going to speak to us again, bring us back to the Matt Martin. So situation and maybe some of the other issues that we need to support too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be back here at this forum once again. We're so grateful at the Coalition for all of the support from throughout the Metro West area, both for the legislative items, for the budget items, and for the direct service work that the Coalition does. Without groups like you here on the ground working with families and individuals, our work wouldn't be possible. And this particular group has been a strong ally since the beginning, since the Advocacy Network was formed. So at the beginning, there was the video of Lynette Martin, one of our interns from Boston College last year, met with Lynette to shoot that video in Lynette's car where she and her son stayed. What she didn't talk about in the video was that there wasn't room for her husband to stay in that car because they have 2 service dogs. So her husband had to find someplace else to stay on that March night, and being separated from their dad, being in the car, her sons were very traumatized by that experience. And they're still coming to terms with that. Lynette was able to join us a few weeks ago at the State House for our annual Legislative Action Day. And one of the things that she talked about is that she continues to be an advocate for other families so they don't have to go through that experience. So she's been working actively to change the policy at the state level and actively working to bring her family to health and to get past that experience. One of the concerns that she had about speaking at Legislative Action Day was that she was in the process of moving. So she and her family have secured housing. They were originally from Framingham, had moved out of state to be able to try to afford housing someplace else, and ended up back in Massachusetts because this is where their roots are. But they have found permanent housing in Marlborough, and they're looking forward to settling in there and having her sons be able to thrive in their new school. But Lynette is just one of the over 3,500 families that we know directly have been impacted by this policy, where the Department of Housing and Community Development requires families to prove that they've already stayed in a place not meant for human habitation before approving those families for state-funded shelter. Looking back to Megan's presentation, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because those are families who are able to come back and prove that they've stayed in their car, in the emergency room, in a campground, in a transit station. A lot of families, when they hear that they have to come back after they've proven that, they disappear. We don't know where those families go. Some of us here in the room know because we're still serving them, but the state doesn't track those families. It doesn't try to follow up. It doesn't give them any helping hand to be able to say, well, this is the process, come back. And in fact, this policy is not required by the state budget language or the state's regulations governing the emergency assistance program. They've chosen to interpret the regulations to be that strict. It says, if you look at the state regulations, that families that are fleeing from domestic violence, fire, flood, natural disaster, a no-fault eviction, or very severe health and safety risk have to be placed if they meet the other eligibility criteria. But it doesn't stop them from placing families who tonight will be going to stay in a place not meant for human habitation. But as Senator Eldridge said, for the last 5.5 years, the state has chosen to interpret the regulations in this way. And so we've been working closely at the Coalition, and with many of you here in the room, with State Representative Marjorie Decker of Cambridge, with Senator Karen Spilka of the Framingham area, to try to change this regulation, and many other legislators. They've been the 2 leads. On the Senate side, because Senator Spilka is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, she's put the language into their version of the budget every year for the past 3 years. And it says that if a family presents to apply for shelter and they're otherwise eligible, they'll be placed that night and not have to come back to prove that they were going to stay in a place not meant for human habitation. Representative Decker hasn't been as fortunate on the House side to be able to get that language into the House version of the budget. And when it comes to the conference committee, when the House and Senate work out the differences between those 2 versions, it's ended up on the cutting room floor. We have reason to hope because there continues to be mobilization. There continues to be families like Lynette's who come forward to share their stories, to share what happens when this policy continues. And there's people like you in the room who continue to reach out to legislators, to reach out to Governor Baker's office to demand change. We're also hopeful, as Senator Eldridge mentioned, that Representative Jeffrey Sanchez is the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. This is the first year that he'll be following the budget process and leading that on the House side. And he's someone who's been a strong advocate on the issues of homelessness, on the issues of housing. And in fact, for multiple generations, his family has. His mother is a longtime housing advocate. And we've had very encouraging conversations with his staff, and we're looking forward, hopefully, to an upcoming meeting directly with him to talk about this very issue. But I know, talking to some of our key allies in the legislature, when they talk to him about this issue, this is something that is resonating with him. But it's not guaranteed, so we must continue to reach out to legislators. If you're coming downstairs for the table portion, we have some letters to sign to your legislators that include this issue, asking for their support. Because we know that it takes constituents calling legislators to ask them to make these changes. It takes legislators talking to legislative leadership. It talks about, we really need to get it more into the media. Get it on the news, get it into our newspapers, have it, people discuss it on social media. And that's a lot of what we've tried to do, but it's sometimes hard with all of the issues going on in our communities and in our country and around the world to really elevate this issue to the level where it needs to be. In a state that's so rich as Massachusetts, that we're requiring families with children to stay in places not meant for human habitation. And if, for example, the parent stays in an unsafe place, but the child had someplace else to stay, that family is still ineligible. The policies are mind-boggling and they're unconscionable. And so we really hope that you'll join with us both to push for the change through the state budget, but to also push for passage of the legislation. So we've talked to key legislators. You can pass it through the budget, you can pass it as a bill, it's your choice, but this policy needs to change. You have this chart that's on the coalition's website. It shows year over year how many families are impacted by the policy. On the bottom was the first year the policy was implemented, so it was only a partial year, so that's why that amount is smaller. At the top is this current fiscal year, and we actually just got the most recent numbers on Fridays. So from July 1st till January 31st, 379 families with children in Massachusetts only were approved for shelter after they proved that they stayed in a place not meant for human habitation. For many of those families, that meant that they got paperwork from the emergency department at a local hospital saying that they had slept there that night. Megan and her colleagues have done research around the impacts on those families and on the medical care system. We know that emergency rooms aren't set up to be shelters. The state has a very robust shelter system. We have providers like Carl and CTI who are doing this work, but we're not letting the families get that far into the process. And not to be cynical, but doing this work for 20 years, seeing that it really is mostly driven by a cost question. It costs $130 on average a night to let a family stay in shelter. This policy is only saving $130 per family to implement it. It doesn't make sense. The state is spending almost $200 million on the family shelter system. So to save $130 per family, or $300,000 per year, why are we doing this? It doesn't add up. Except if you're in the mindset of the administration where you've publicly said you're going to end homelessness, you're going to end the use of overflow spaces in hotels and motels. The state talks about we're down to 46 families in motels. This is one of the reasons why, because we're not letting families in. The state issued a report on how many families were approved for shelter. The December report showed that 75% of families who applied for shelter were approved. Those of you who track these reports will know that's pretty shocking because in an average month, they normally say that they've only approved 50% of families. So we reached out to the state to say, oh, were there any changes in the policies? And like, oh, we'll have to get back to you on that. And so the new report that came out was back down to about 59%. But what we think is happening is that they're actually pre-screening families. When we've talked to families themselves, we've talked to providers, we've talked to people in legal services, that what the state is doing, the Department of Housing and Community Development, is that when a family goes to apply for shelter, they'll say, well, you know, there's not that many shelter spaces, as Carl described, you might be placed far away from your home community, and do you fall into one of these 4 categories of eligibility? And it's gonna take all day to apply, so if you don't think you fit in, you should probably leave now. That's one of the typical ways that families are discouraged from exercising their legal right to apply for shelter. And so we need to have honest conversations here in Massachusetts. What is happening? Why are we sending families away when they have a legal right to shelter? Massachusetts legislators, lawmakers, people in the administration constantly say that this is a right to shelter state. That isn't a right if nobody's able to exercise it and exercise it on a consistent basis. And so we want to have those really honest conversations around what are we up against? What are the dynamics? What do we need to do? We know that we need to get to more housing. We need to get to better homelessness prevention resources. But we also need to maintain this safety net of shelter for families when they need it. Same goes for individuals, for unaccompanied youth, for people with disabilities, for elders. This particular program only serves families with children, but we are working on legislative priorities for all of those populations. The homelessness prevention front is something that we take very seriously. We know that in Massachusetts, it's very hard for families and individuals to be able to afford the startup costs to move into a new apartment, but also to maintain an existing apartment. Groups like Community Teamwork are on the ground providing homelessness prevention resources through programs like the Residential Assistance for Families in Transition program, RAFT. And that's been another key priority of the coalition, to design the program to make sure that it's fully funded, which is still an ongoing struggle. But this year, there's $15 million in the state budget to pay for needs such as first month's rent, last month's rent, security deposits, pay for back rent, back utility bills, and those transportation costs. Carl talked about the family going out to Montana, that the state can help families in those transitions. And since last year, also able to help individuals and households without children. But we need to bring those programs to scale. We know that we have the ability to prevent homelessness if we're able to connect people with timely resources. The RAFT program only provides up to $4,000 per family, but households generally don't even need that full $4,000. The average payment is usually under $3,000. So for a small amount of money, we're able to help households avoid homelessness if we can connect them with the resources in a timely way. If not, we're seeing the state spend over $40,000 per family to keep them in shelter. Why would we do that if a family's homelessness could be prevented, or if we could help a family exit a shelter quickly into more permanent housing? Lynette and her family, for example, they were in shelter for 1.5 years. Both Lynette and her husband work full-time, and they work low-wage jobs. And so they weren't able to quickly exit shelter. So they were looking for additional supports and resources. And it took a lot of time to make those connections, unfortunately. So we're continuing to advocate on the prevention front and also on the long-term affordable housing front. Senator Eldridge mentioned programs like the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program. We need to continue to invest in state-funded housing subsidy programs, as well as state-funded public housing. State-funded public housing has been underfunded for decades. The housing stock is crumbling, but we know that it's an important part of the first line to be able to prevent homelessness. And so we hope that you'll continue the advocacy to work with us both on the legislative front and on the bill front to change these policies around access to shelter, but also to advocate for increased access to homelessness prevention and to long-term housing resources, and the wraparound services that people need to be able to achieve stability and to maintain it. And so look forward to having conversations downstairs with many of you on these topics. Just to note where we are in the legislative cycle, the legislature is working on their version of the budget. There was a public hearing on Friday at the State House in front of the Ways and Means Committee. We got to testify, I think, in hour 5, but there was a lot of people who turned out who want to have their voices heard around issues, and I would say probably 100%, I was there for the whole hearing, so I think it's true, 100% of the people were there talking about issues of poverty, disability, and homelessness. And this is one of the few times where there's a panel of legislators who are dedicated to spend the day and listen to these issues. And so There's still time to submit written testimony to the Ways and Means Committee, so if you're so inclined, we can give you sample testimony to send both to the committee and to your own legislator. That's something that's really important, so they know that it wasn't just those people in the room. We know many people couldn't stay the full 5.5, 6 hours for the hearing, and so some people left without testifying. But that's an important part of the legislative process here in Massachusetts, to have these public hearings, to have people show up and to talk about the importance of these programs, or to echo the words of people who were able to attend. The governor came out with his version of the budget at the end of January, and the House is gearing up to debate their version of the budget in late April. And so we're still in the process of trying to influence both the House Committee on Ways and Means and the Senate Committee on Ways and Means in their versions of the budget. The Senate will have their budget debate in late May, and then the House and Senate will appoint conferees to bring the budget together to reconcile the differences and hopefully have a final budget in place by July 1st. So hopefully July 1st we can celebrate that this policy change has been made, that families no longer will be required to stay in places not meant for human habitation, and get to the rest of the work that we have to do, and all the other issues that remain undone. But we really encourage you to stay connected through the coalition. We have email lists, we have monthly meetings and conference calls, and encourage you to stay connected with the advocacy network that I know that Carl and Frank and Jane are sending out emails with information about where we are in the budget process and how to weigh in. But I can't emphasize enough how critical it is that even if by you showing up here today, the legislators who were here or those who will hear about it, to know that people in the community care, because they're accountable to you. So holding our legislators accountable is a key part of the advocacy, and so I applaud you for being here on a Sunday and for your continued work, and just really grateful that the coalition has partners like you. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen. How many of you have been to our forums in the past? Excellent. That's a little better than what we usually see. I like to see that we have several hands that are down, because we do, as has been mentioned, have a long list of folks who want to advocate and receive our alerts. And I would double up on what Kelly had just said. Kelly and Mass Coalition have an incredibly effective system for communicating changes in legislation and progress of these issues through the legislature. I would encourage you to go there as well, get on their mailing list, but please, please, if I make no other request, make sure you've signed up here and indicated a willingness to receive, and best for us is email on the various issues that are coming up. On the matter of the Lynette Martin issue and the EA eligibility, in addition to the budget provision, which will solve that. There's also legislation that we want to watch in the same type of way and find out when we can jump in and advocate for that. A lot of these issues seem to come right now down to the House Ways and Means group, and we do have, now we have a contact with a church down in Jamaica Plain to bring a meeting such as ours here to Jamaica Plain. Representative Sanchez is very receptive to this issue, and if we get his constituents to try to speak about this, why, maybe that'll help bring it through the House Ways and Means. So those are the types of things we do. Please put your name down on the list. We'll keep you up on what we're doing and what we see coming. And I'm not going to say too much more than that, because we really are way behind. And we have some cake to eat. So if your choice is mine, why, let's go get some cake. This is Jane.
Okay, so let's go. We're going to go right down those stairs to the parish hall. There are things to drink, there's coffee, there's cake. There are lots of organizations that are eager to share what they do with you. Thank you so much.